Thank you, Professor. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight, both in person and virtually. I am excited and honored to introduce tonight's lecture, the final in Dr. Reinhardt's three-part series, Separation Anxieties, Jews, Judaism, and the Creation of Christianity. This program is a part of Fordham Center for Jewish Studies Distinguished Lecture Series, and distinguished is a fitting word for tonight's speaker and her prolific and impactful career. In tonight's lecture, entitled Conflict Theory, Dr. Adele Reinhartz will examine a more recent evolution in the study of early Jewish-Christian relations. So a little bit about that. From the late 20th century to the present, the process by which Christianity became an entity separate from Judaism is most often described by the metaphor, the parting of the ways. Even those who critique the metaphor end up using it. This metaphor is built around the notion of conflict between ancient Jews and the Jesus community, but like the mother-daughter metaphor that Dr. Reinhartz discussed last week, it reflects the sensibilities of scholars at least as much as it does the ancient evidence. What does this mean for how we might talk about Christian origins in the future? Now, a little about our speaker. Dr. Adele Reinhartz is a professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa. Her work unites the fields of New Testament, early Jewish-Christian relations, the Bible and film, and feminist biblical criticism. She has authored 9 books, including Befriending the Beloved Disciple, a Jewish reading of the Gospel of John, Cast Out of the Covenant, Jesus, Jews, and Anti-Judaism, and the Gospel of John, and most recently, Bible and Cinema, an Introduction, in addition to many articles on a wide range of topics. Dr. Reinhartz was inducted into the Royal Society of Canada in 2005 and into the American Academy for Jewish Research in 2014. She was the general editor of the Journal of Biblical Literature from 2012 to 2019 and president of the Society of Biblical Literature in 2020. In 2021, she was awarded the Konrad Adenauer Research Prize, given to one Canadian researcher annually by the Humboldt Foundation in Germany. And this semester, we are very lucky to have her join us at Fordham as a faculty fellow at the Center for Jewish Studies. I was thinking earlier that I wish there was a way in these introductions to give a sense of the impact that she's had on other scholars and people in the field. So I wanted to add that according to Google Scholar, her work has been cited 2,500 times. And then I was thinking that I can only imagine how big that number would be if it included graduate student seminar papers that never get published. I also get to introduce tonight's respondent, Fordham's own Dr. Emanuel Fiano. Dr. Fiano is an assistant professor in the theology department at Fordham University, where he researches the intellectual history of late ancient Christianity, with a particular focus on Syriac and Coptic literature, on religious controversies, on Christian-Jewish relations, and on canonical production. His first monograph, Three Powers in Heaven, The Emergence of Theology and the Parting of the Ways, is forthcoming from Yale University Press in June 2023, so mark your calendars. Make sure you get a copy before they sell out. Dr. Fiano will offer his response after Dr. Reinhardt's lecture, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion together. So now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Reinhartz.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. We'll begin with a little review. The lecture series, as you know, is entitled Separation Anxieties, Jews, Judaism, and the Creation of Christianity. And as I've already mentioned in my previous 2 lectures, the title conveys 2 main points. One is that scholars have linked the origins of Christianity to its separation from Judaism. And the second, that this separation has been a matter of some anxiety for historians and theologians. Throughout, I have argued that the attempts to resolve this anxiety have been shaped more by the intellectual climate of the scholars' own times than by the primary sources themselves. In the first talk, I argued that 19th and early 20th century theologians and historians often frame the question of Christian origins in terms of the great man theory popularized by Thomas Carlyle in the mid-19th century. This theory fostered a debate as to whether it was Jesus or Paul that created Christianity. Great man theory resolved the anxiety inherent in the debate by situating the break with Judaism in the life and thought of Jesus and or Paul. Last week, we looked at the ways in which many of these same theologians, knowingly or not, adopted and adapted evolutionary and genetic metaphors introduced by the theories of Charles Darwin and Gregor Mendel. These metaphors help theologians extend and deepen their arguments for how and why Christianity is similar to, but also separate from, her mother, Judaism. The linear versions of evolutionary theory allowed theologians to acknowledge the Jewish roots of Christianity and at the same time to maintain a triumphalist view of Christianity as superior and to view this superiority as a natural consequence of humankind's evolution towards a higher state of perfection, namely Christianity. In this, the final talk in the series, we will fast forward from the turn of the 20th century to the present moment and to the metaphor that currently prevails in scholarship on Christian origins, the parting of the ways. This metaphor has become so common that even scholars like myself who critique the metaphor end up using it for lack of a widely accepted alternative. As far as I know, the first time the parting metaphor appeared in print was in the title of a book by F.J. Folks Jackson in 1912, entitled The Parting of the Roads. 2 decades later, in 1934, James Parks used The Parting of the Ways as the title of chapter 3 of his classic book, Conflict Between Church and Synagogue. But the metaphor did not otherwise appear in this book. I searched, there's no index. So I searched page by page by page, and it doesn't appear anywhere else except in the title of chapter 3. It took until the early 1990s for the metaphor to become popular through the work of James Dunn and many other scholars. Like the mother-daughter and sibling metaphors that we discussed last week, the parting of the ways reflects perspectives that did not arise from the primary sources as such, but from the intellectual context of its proponents. There are two elements in particular that account, in my view, for the development and the ongoing appeal of this metaphor. One pertains to the historical events of the 20th century that shaped the consciousness of many Europeans and North Americans. The two world wars, the War of Independence in the Middle East, the partition of India, the Korean War, and the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina redrew the world map, as did the creation and dissolution of the Soviet Union. Anyone watching these events, whether up close and personal or from news reports, would come away with the conviction that boundaries and identities are made and unmade through conflict. It is a short step from these observations to the idea that conflict is essential to the creation of new political, religious, social entities, and to allow this idea to shape the narrative of Christian origins. The second element that it has shaped the parting metaphor pertains to the post-Holocaust reckoning of the Christian churches about the role played by anti-Jewish teachings in preparing the ground for the Nazi program of extermination. These teachings include supersessionism, the quote-unquote perfidy of the Jews, and the charge of deicide. An important result of this reckoning was the Vatican II document Nostra Aetate, which stated, among other things, that, quote, although the church is the new people of God, the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures, end quote. And then later on in the same document, quote, the church, mindful of the patrimony she shares with the Jews, and moved not by political reasons, but by the gospel's spiritual love, decries hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone, end quote. Protestant churches issued similar statements, and many scholars of the New Testament and early Christianity endeavored to rewrite the narratives of the historical Jesus, Pauline literature, and Christian origins in ways that avoided or at least minimized their anti-Jewish overtones. The parting of the ways metaphor has played an important role in this process of rethinking and rewriting. So let us now turn to how this metaphor functions within the discourse of Christian origins. So again, a review, recap of the main points from last week's discussion of metaphor theory. At its core, metaphor denotes, quote, the transfer of a concept endowed with a meaning derived from one specific context to another context, end quote. Metaphors can be found in every type of speech and discourse, from the everyday to the highly esoteric, and they are essential to the practice of historiography, as they are to most other fields, from art history to zoology. Metaphors are both descriptive and generative. They provide concise descriptions of complex hypotheses or narratives, but they also push discourses in directions that they might not have taken based on the evidence alone. And metaphors serve purposes that go beyond description. They often support ideologies, prejudices, and a range of unstated assumptions. For these reasons, metaphors must be evaluated and either accepted, modified, or discarded on the basis of what underlies them and how well they account for the evidence. Last week, I argued that the mother-daughter metaphor shows the influence of evolutionary and genetic theory, which became popular at the same time that this metaphor became a standard part of the discourse. And I suggested that the metaphor really should be discarded. Not only is it inherently supersessionist, but it also presents a false view of Judaism based on a priori theological convictions rather than a study of the sources. Our question today is whether the parting of the ways metaphor does any better. The parting of the ways metaphor has its source in the world of civil engineering, specifically transportation. In its literal sense, the metaphor refers to a single thoroughfare, a highway, that splits into two roadways, each leading in a different direction. It is important to note that the metaphor does not refer to the people who travel these routes, but to the routes themselves. The metaphor, therefore, does not refer to the ways in which people constructed their identities as Christians or as non-Christians, or neither, but to the existence of two or more paths that individuals could take. Just as drivers can take one road one day and another road the next, the same was true of individuals, if they so wished. They could potentially choose among these different roads on any given day, even if, like many drivers, they tend to follow the same route most or all of the time. The parting of the ways implies a single origin for what became two distinct entities, Judaism and Christianity. It does not, however, draw attention to the road similarities, nor does it imply any engagement, cooperation, tension, rivalry between them. In that sense, it is more neutral, but also perhaps less descriptive than the familial metaphors that we considered last week. There is nothing about a metaphor, but a roadway that requires it to maintain any of the elements, such as the number of lanes, the width of those lanes, the number of exits, whether there are rest stops or not, that characterize the thoroughfare from which it emerged or to which it runs parallel. Despite its lack of complex resonances, however, the roadway metaphor has had a generative and productive role in the discourse on Christian origins. Anyone who drives along a major highway knows that diverging roadways are marked by fixed exit signs and off-ramps. Unless there is construction, as occurs all summer long in Ottawa, where I live, these signs do not change from day to day or year to year. Similarly, the parting of the ways prompts or perhaps simply reflects the historian's search for a specific date or event that marks the moment of parting. Just as off-ramps mark a gradual move towards the new roadway, there would have been a buildup to separation. Nevertheless, there remains a moment when the split becomes definitive and is recognized by all parties. The parting of the ways metaphor has much to commend it. Like the familial models, it acknowledges the common origins of Judaism and what became Christianity. Like the sibling image, it recognizes that Judaism, far from stagnating, continued to develop in its own distinct ways after the ways parted. And in contrast to familial metaphors, the parting of the ways does not presuppose or imply the superiority of Christianity over Judaism. Rather, it suggests simply that Christianity went off in one direction and Judaism in another, without necessarily implying that one way led to salvation and the other to a dead end. Nevertheless, the metaphor is by no means problem-free. The roadway comparison implies that the development of a Christian movement independent of Judaism had to do precisely with two isms, two sets of institutions, beliefs, and practices that were as clearly set off from one another as two roads that diverge and then head in different directions. This observation, in turn, presumes a unified and singular entity that we call Judaism and another one that we can call Christianity. But this flies in the face of the well-documented diversity within what we commonly refer to as early Judaism, as well as the diverse groups that laid claim to the label Christianity once it became widely used. Second, and as I've already mentioned, the metaphor implies that like two diverging roadways, the ways between Judaism and Christianity parted at a single, clearly definable point in time. This resonance pushes scholars to pinpoint a moment, or at least a time period, when the parting would have occurred. For James Dunn, whose work popularized the metaphor, the proposed time frame is between the first Jewish revolt against Rome, 66 to 74 CE, and the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135. Dunn and many others argued that as the Jesus movement grew rapidly through the influx of Gentile adherents, it also developed theologically in ways that were unacceptable and even threatening to Jewish leadership. Some versions of this scenario hold that the actual parting of the ways occurred when the synagogue expelled the believers in Christ from its midst. This is a clear case in which the metaphor itself pushes the discourse. The spatial element of the metaphor source domain, the image of a roadway or highway, seems to require a temporal parallel in the metaphor's target domain, implying a linear history of Christianity's development. Our sources, however, suggest that the parting of the ways was an uneven and messy process, occurring at different times, in different places, and for different reasons. On these grounds, some have suggested modifications to the metaphor. James Dunn himself made pointed use of the plural later on to counteract oversimplification. So he wrote a book called The Partings of the Ways. Judith Liu has suggested that we should think of a crisscrossing of muddy tracks rather than two clearly marked paths. To Daniel Boyarin, the fluidity and variety in beliefs, practices, and identities in the early centuries suggested that far from separating into two ways, Judaism and Christianity constituted a continuous roadway with imperceptible boundaries. These modifications, and we can argue about them, that they have their merits, and at the same time, they have not caught on. Rather, scholars still use the parting metaphor, even as they emphasize that they don't accept it in whole or in part. Even those who are most committed to the metaphor will agree on the diversity of first century Judaism and the messiness of the process. And here again, James Dunn, who kept revising and changing his mind well into his later years. So this is what he said. The parting of the ways, properly speaking, was very bitty, B-I-T-T-Y, long drawn out and influenced by a range of social, geographical, and political, as well as theological factors. On the one hand, we must beware of thinking of a clear or single trajectory for either Christianity or Judaism. And we should also avoid using imagery, which necessarily implies an ever-widening gap between Christianity and Judaism. On the other hand, Christianity did emerge from a Jewish matrix, and Christianity and Judaism did become separate and distinct. So the basic image, the parting of the ways, remains appropriate. According to Dunn, then, the metaphor still accounts for important evidence, even if it oversimplifies the situation. Most other proponents of the metaphor agree that the process of separation cannot be pinned down to one specific time. But they also assert that there was nevertheless a point at which the diverse Christ-confessing individuals and groups would have seen themselves and be seen by others as separate from Jews in their own diverse groups. The roadways metaphor has generated considerable controversy, due in great measure to the points I've just mentioned. Although critics have identified the pitfalls and problems of the metaphor, in most cases, these critiques of the metaphor are actually not critiques of the metaphor itself, but rather critiques of the tendency to date the parting to the late 1st or early 2nd century. This is something, when you read the scholarship, at a certain point you realize what they say they're arguing about is not actually what they're arguing about. And that's the case with this one. The dating, so they were arguing against the late 1st century dating of the parting. This dating, they argue, ignores the significant contact between Jews and Christians in the early centuries, the Common Era, and it ignores the capacity for seamless movement between these groups. For these reasons, these critics suggest that the parting could not have taken place prior to the Christianization of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. This argument has gained considerable traction over the past 2 decades, in large measure to the volume entitled The Ways That Never Parted, edited by Adam Becker and Annette Yoshiko-Reed, based on a 2002 Princeton conference by the same name. I must confess that this entire argument puzzled me for a long time. Although I agreed completely that the parting was a lengthy, complicated, and as I've already said, messy process that varied from place to place and era to era, the criterion of social contact seemed off base and irrelevant. Although its proponents sometimes describe their approach as an argument against the parting metaphor, in fact, it's an argument only against the assumption that Jews and Christians would have had no social contact after the ways had parted. Yet no one, not Dunn or anyone else who proposes a late 1st century parting, ever said that the parting meant the end to social contact. Nobody said that, but the whole argument is about that. As Shai Cohen bluntly states, quote, "The notion of the parting of the ways does not in the least suggest that Jews and Christians stopped speaking with each other, arguing with each other, and influencing each other. Mutual reactions neither prove nor disprove a parting of the ways. They prove only that Jews and Christians continued to speak with each other," end quote. Eventually, I realized, in pondering this whole line of argumentation, that the social contact criterion did not arise from the evidence, but from a different understanding of the parting of the ways metaphor as such. Whereas the early parting scholars, those who dated the parting to the period between the 2 revolts, understood the parting of the ways as a roadway metaphor, the late parting scholars, those who dated it to the 4th century, take it as a divorce metaphor. The divorce register of the parting metaphor could theoretically imply, of course, an abrupt parting, like the roadway's source domain. In that case, we might see the breakup between Judaism and Christianity as a blow-up, where one partner stalks angrily out of the marital home, never to return. And this nasty breakup would have occurred in the late 1st or early 2nd century. That's the early parting theory. Otherwise, the divorce metaphor connotes a gradual breakdown of relationship with many ups and downs, twists and turns, and leading eventually to a partial or complete break in social contact by the 4th century. These resonances affect 2 elements of the parting discourse. One is the shift in focus from 2 discrete pathways that we might call Judaism and Christianity to the people who travel on these pathways, whom we might call Jews and Christians. The second, the criterion of social contact, follows from the first. In considering roadways, social contact is a non-issue, but when talking about parting of the ways in relationships, it looms large. The divorce version of the parting metaphor has had very broad appeal among scholars who work on Christian origins. As with the roadways version of the metaphor, there is no hint of supersessionism. Everyone, no matter when or how they worshipped, was buffeted by the vagaries of Roman law and policy, and everyone participated in various rituals and practices and maintained some sort of contact with one another. The metaphor also draws attention from the problematic abstractions and essentializing implied by the labels Judaism and Christianity, when they focus instead on Jews and Christians. But I would argue that despite the importance of social contact in our understanding of Jewish-Christian relations from the ancient period to the present, social contact is not a criterion for establishing the process by which a complex entity or set of entities we now call Christianity became independent of Jews, Jewishness, and Judaism. All the evidence suggests that Jews and Christians always remained in contact in the geographical areas where both groups were present. While some sort of contact was certainly negative, there were always Jews and Christians who maintained positive personal or business relationships. A clear example can be found in the presence of Jewish and Christian merchant stalls side by side in close proximity to the Sardis synagogue in modern-day Turkey. The synagogue remains that are now visible are generally dated to the mid-4th century, though some would date them as late as the 6th century. In any case, however, the synagogue and the environs of the synagogue testify to ongoing Jewish-Christian contact even in the period after Constantine. Taken to its logical conclusion, the use of social contact as a criterion would suggest, as the title of Becker and Reed's volume indicates, that the ways never parted. Yet it is hard to ignore the fact that Jews and Christians did come to see themselves as belonging to different groups, and they were seen that way by others. I also want to emphasize that to construe the parting of the ways as a divorce metaphor is in effect to confuse the roadways with the people who travel on them. We know that Christians participated in Jewish festivals well into the 4th century. We know this because the church father John Chrysostom rails against them. Though I am not aware of any direct evidence, one might imagine that there were 1st or 2nd or 3rd century Jews attending synagogue on Saturday and church on Sunday. This does not mean, however, that they did not know or did not perceive that they were moving between two separate institutions or communities. The fact that individuals could move between between two groups does not negate the boundaries between those two groups. If it is possible for people today to make these distinctions, we should assume that ancient people were also capable of making them. This suggests that the debate that is constructed by some of the contributors to the Becker and Reed volume is based not on different hypotheses concerning dating and criteria, but rather on a confused conflation of roadways and travelers. Third, the historical conclusions drawn from the metaphor are problematic. While it may be the case that the ways did not fully part until the 4th century, there is ample evidence that Jews and Christians were recognized as belonging to different groups long before that time. Shai Cohen argues that Christians not only differentiated themselves from Jews by the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, but also that they were seen that way by Romans. After the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, Rome imposed a tax called the Fiscus Judaicus on all Jews. But by the end of the 1st century, the tax was levied only on those who lived openly as Jews, thereby excluding those who did not. And that would have included Gentile Christians and perhaps Jewish Christians as well. Roman persecutions of Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries did not target Jews, and Roman persecution of Jews after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 did not target Christians. For Romans, Jews and Christians were distinct groups. As John Barclay has stated, no pagan author places Christians under the heading of Jews, or even associated the two groups with one another. For Romans, the Jews are an alien superstition following an ethnic tradition, and Christians are a novel superstition embraced by a criminal cabal, end quote. So this line of argumentation, namely by Cohen and Barclay, is based on the assumption that two groups that are seen to be separate by a third party may in fact have been separate, or at least may have seen themselves as such. This does not mean that Jews and Christians did not have social contact, nor does it mean that some Jews and Christians could or did not participate in each other's festivals or rituals, whether frequently or occasionally. It just means that certain practices and certain institutions were becoming widely recognized as separate. As we have seen, the different metaphors for the relationships between Judaism and Christianity push their respective discourses in particular directions, and each encourages us to construct the historical narrative in a different way. The mother-daughter metaphor leads scholars to argue for natural succession and the natural superiority of Christianity over Judaism. The sibling metaphor pushes us to define specific causes of rivalry between rabbinic Judaism and patristic Christianity. The roadway foundation of the parting metaphor focuses on institutionalization and group identity. Construing the parting of the ways as a divorce story leads to a focus on social contact. In both versions of the parting metaphor, as well as the sibling metaphor discussed last week, conflict plays a central role. Alan Siegel suggested that the ways in which each system conceived of its core tasks, keeping the people sacrosanct for Judaism and missionary activity for Christianity, led to a collision course where separation was necessary. In Dunn's view, the separation occurred over differing interpretations of four key pillars of Judaism: monotheism, election, Torah, and temple. There are New Testament interpreters, as I've already mentioned, who believe that Jewish authorities kicked Christians out of the synagogue because they believed in Jesus as the Messiah. All versions of the parting of the ways metaphor presume that the separation came in the aftermath or as a consequence of theological or other sorts of conflict. The centrality of conflict in these narratives of Christian origins reflects the assumption, as I've already mentioned, that new national or religious entities and identities are established through conflict. This is not to say that theologians and historians were conversant with political theory or military history. They would just have needed some awareness of 20th century history. Anyone who had paid attention, slightest bit of attention, to their high school history classes and to world events would have learned that conflict almost always resulted in a redrawing of national boundaries and a creation of new entities. I would suggest, however, that another element is also at work. This element is what I've termed the narrative imperative. Historians, like novelists, write narratives, and in doing so, they need to create a narrative arc that must begin with a situation of stability, which is then disrupted and finally resolved into a new stability. As in fiction, so too in historical narratives, the disruption almost always entails conflict, whether between two people, two groups, or even between abstract concepts. It would be hard to write a compelling narrative of Christian origins without conflict. I know because I've tried. These observations suggest that historians and theologians are attracted to metaphors and theories involving conflict due to their own presuppositions about how both history and narrative work. At the same time, I would argue, scholars are also pulled in the opposite direction, away from conflict. As we've seen, the great man and evolutionary approaches that were popular around the turn of the 20th century furthered the anti-Jewish supersessionist agenda that was characteristic of many Christian thinkers at that time. The parting of the ways metaphor, by contrast, is congenial to scholars living in open and diverse societies in what we call the West, countries in which Jews and Christians engage freely with one another and with people of other traditions as well. The experience of living in an open society reinforces the post-Holocaust repudiation of anti-Semitism, the reclamation of Jesus' Jewish identity, and the strong interest in Second Temple Judaism stimulated by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These social factors and attitudes propel us towards metaphors of mutuality that describe both Judaism and Christianity as active agents in the process that resulted in their differentiation. As I have argued throughout this series, theologians and historians have generally seen Judaism as constitutive of Christianity. Not only did Christianity take some fundamental elements from Judaism, but also, in the eyes of many scholars, separation from Judaism was essential to Christianity's own development. In the spirit of mutuality, some scholars, such as Daniel Bayarin, Alan Siegel, Michal Bar-Asher Siegel, Yisrael Yuval, and many others, want to argue that Christianity was constitutive of Judaism in the same way that Judaism was constitutive of Christianity. To this point, however, I see no evidence for this claim prior to the rabbinic period, if then. But I believe that scholars of Christianity and Judaism are motivated by an impulse towards mutuality that fits with the post-Holocaust spirit of reconciliation and rapprochement. The parting of the ways metaphor, like the approaches that I've discussed in the first two talks in this series, both expresses and resolves the separation anxiety experienced by scholars of early Christianity. Both the roadway and divorce versions account for similarities between Judaism and Christianity, at the same time as they offer hypotheses for how, why, and when Christianity emerged from the matrix of Second Temple and first century Judaism. The mutuality implied in the metaphor provides a more irenic response to the anxiety than other theories. But the very impulse towards mutuality also betrays an anxiety that is not entirely resolved. It is still worth asking, however, whether the parting metaphor in either version corresponds to the sources and the facts as we know them. This question is not easily answered, due both to the sparseness of the evidence and to the ambiguity of the evidence that we do have. On the one hand, the parting metaphor acknowledges commonalities between Judaism and Christianity, and the ideas, beliefs, texts, and values that Jews and Christians would have shared even in the early centuries of the Common Era. In this sense, we can say that it makes sense of the facts as we know them. Even if we cannot figure out exactly when, how, or why Christianity moved outside its Jewish matrix, we can say with certainty that it began there, and it retains some important elements. On the other hand, it is crucial to understand that the parting of the ways is an inherently Christianity-centered metaphor. It intends to explain an aspect of Christian origins and to account for both similarities and differences between Judaism and Christianity. The mutuality implied by the metaphor can be applauded as an antidote to supersessionism and anti-Judaism, but is it warranted by our sources? While we have ample evidence, for example, of Christian leaders who encourage their audiences to distance themselves from non-Christians, we have virtually no reliable evidence from the early centuries of the Common Era for a Jewish role in the parting of the ways from Christ-confessing groups. Certainly, the New Testament and patristic literature describes some Jews as objecting vehemently and sometimes violently to the messianic claims about Jesus. But given the theological agendas of these texts and the absence of corroborating evidence from other sources, the Jewish side of this mutual process is difficult to document. Of course, the absence of sources may not be meaningful. As the well-worn proverb goes, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And in theory, it is possible that relevant first century Jewish sources may surface at some future point in time. But for now, we don't have much to go on. The massive oeuvre of Josephus contains but two scant references related to Jesus, and at least one of them was probably not written by Josephus at all. Rabbinic literature contains some references and allusions to Christians and to Jesus, but these post-date all of the New Testament books. While significant for the history of Jewish-Christian relations, they don't shed light on the historical process of separation to which the parting of the ways metaphor refers. I would therefore urge us to consider the possibility that the parting was not a mutual endeavor, and that Jewish-Christian relations in the ancient world, and I would say now also, are not symmetrical. It is highly likely, in my view, that most first and second century Jews did not know much, if anything at all, about Jesus and his followers, and those of us who did know something may not have cared. The Jesus movement may not have loomed large for most Jews until Christianity began to take hold and exercise political power in the Roman world. This observation raises the possibility that while the story is built around the relationship between two protagonists called Judaism and Christianity, or two groups called Jews and Christians, while these stories may satisfy certain theological or apologetic needs, they don't necessarily constitute plausible narratives. They take all the evidence and the absence of evidence into account. Perhaps then the current metaphors and stories of Christian origins give too much weight to the Jewish role in the separation process. And indeed, perhaps the process by which Christianity separated from Judaism should not be conceptualized as a separation at all, but as an inevitable consequence of its growth, its changing demographic composition, and its processes of institutionalization. And if so, we may entertain the possibility that the preoccupation with Jewishness in our Christian sources may not have had much to do with Jewish actions against Christ confessors, but with the need to articulate an independent and more detailed identity using the genres of the gospel, the commentary, the homily, the epistle that were available for these purposes. We may posit that as the Jesus movement grew and developed, it had to disentangle itself from Jews, Jewish institutions, and Jewish practices, precisely in order to develop an independent identity. The anti-Jewish discourse in the New Testament and subsequent Christian literature reflects both the necessity and the difficulty of this disengagement. The necessity, because over time, the majority of believers in Christ were of pagan rather than Jewish origin, and they did not observe boundary marking practices such as circumcision and the Jewish dietary laws. The difficulty, because at the same time as Jewish identification was rejected, the new movement also claimed the Jewish scriptures, in Greek, the Jews' God, and many Jewish values and social practices as their own. Perhaps then we should not talk about a parting of the ways, but a departure of the way being a term used for Christ confessors in the book of Acts. A departure that was justified and indeed promoted rhetorically by positing Jewish violence against Jesus and his followers. Of course, this story of mine is just as speculative as the narratives that I have critiqued. It simply takes the same evidence available to all, views it from a different angle, and weighs it differently than others might do. And I'm not yet ready to claim that it corresponds any better to what actually happens than the alternatives. My point is simply to suggest that contrary to the resonances of the parting metaphor, the relationship between ancient Jews and Christians may have been neither reciprocal nor symmetrical. It is the needs of post-Holocaust scholars, precisely those who both promote and critique the parting of the ways metaphor, that have made them so. To sum up, the parting of the ways metaphor implies a mutual and symmetrical process for which we have no evidence. Perhaps then the process did not resemble two roads that diverged from each other or from a central thoroughfare, nor was it a matter of two partners in relationships separating from one another and being transformed in the process. But rather, as I've suggested, separation may have been required by the growth of Christ-confessing communities themselves. Whereas Christianity had to part from Judaism in order to grow and develop, Judaism did not require that separation in order to continue its own development. Such reflections have suggested to me a line of inquiry that may give us a different perspective again. As it is currently framed in our field, the parting of the ways is about Christian origins, as indeed has been our focus throughout this lecture series. And this emphasis is also reflected in the disciplinary homes of the scholars who work on this question. Although the separation of Christianity from Judaism is, in theory, a question that should span the interests of specialists in both Christian origins and early Judaism, the scholarly record shows that it is a central interest primarily to the former group and almost entirely ignored by Jewish studies scholars. But what if we turn the question around to focus not on what the parting of the ways says about Christianity, but rather on whether or to what extent the Jesus movement can tell us something about the boundaries of Jewish identity in the 1st to the 4th centuries of the Common Era? What can Christianity's separation from the Jewish fold tell us about ancient Jewish diversity? Does it point to specific beliefs and practices that mark not only inner Jewish differences, but also the outer limits of Jewish identification? Or is it plausible to imagine that Christianity could have developed an independent identity, even if its beliefs and practices did not exceed those boundaries, the boundaries of Jewish identity, any more than did groups who remained within a Jewish matrix? Reframing the question in these ways would mean inserting the parting of the ways into the historiography of ancient Jewish diversity, in which it is usually ignored. I don't yet know where such a reorientation of the parting question might lead, but this is what I'll be working on while I'm here in New York for my sabbatical, and I suspect for the next few years as well. In the meantime, I want to express my appreciation again to the Center for Jewish Studies here at Fordham for the honor of giving these lectures and for welcoming me so warmly. And also my thanks to all of you for watching and listening. Thank you.
To begin with, I'd like to thank Professor Reinhartz for an incredibly rich lecture, which concludes an incredibly rich series from which I've learned an immense amount. I approach my task tonight not without some anxieties of my own, not only because of the stature of the lecturer to whom I'm responding, but also because I'm the prime offender for the casual use of the parting of the ways metaphor, despite sharing many of the reservations set forth in today's talk. So because the unexamined metaphor is not worth living by, to both paraphrase Socrates and Plato's Apology and appropriate the title of Lakoff and Johnson's all-cited book, I would like to make just 3 points in dependence on Professor Reinhardt's examination of the parting of the ways metaphor. 2 conclusions in the lecture resonated with me most strongly. The first one is the idea that, quote, perhaps the process by which Christianity became an entity separate from Judaism should not be conceptualized as a separation at all, but as an inevitable consequence of its growth, its demographic composition, and its institutionalization. End of quote. This appears to me as an extremely important claim, not least because it implicitly goes in the helpful direction of examining the rubric under which the analysis of identity or the similarity between Judaism and Christianity is conducted. I believe that one lens through which the growth of which Professor Reinhartz speaks could be pertinently elucidated is that of Jesus-confessing thinkers' development of a cohesive set of intellectual practices governing the production of religious knowledge. A possibility then is that Christianity, by intellectual tradition, the question of the rubric, underwent its individuation when it precipitated away from Judaism as a result of the crystallization of these styles of inquiry. The 2 groups, rabbis and theologians, were interested in disparate avenues of religious investigation, their differences emerging primarily as ones not of beliefs, but of intellectual methods. The second historical claim that most struck me in the lecture is the suggestion that, quote, the parting was not a mutual endeavor, nor were Jewish-Christian relations symmetrical. The Jesus movement may not have loomed large for most Jews until Christianity began to take hold and exercise political power in the Roman world, end of quote. In fact, even when Christians began to exercise their power in the Roman Empire, they do not appear to have loomed as large in European imagination. Of course, this is complicated by the issue of geographic location, as the Jews did in that of the church writers. Rabbinic identity was articulated in opposition to various figures of otherness, including the sectarian minim, with whom Christians were probably lumped, but never predominantly in specific relation to Christianity. The rabbis were as wary of Christians as they were of any other forms of social life that eluded their normative impulses, but they appeared hardly as concerned with the existence of Christianity as the metaphor of two siblings vying for supremacy, of which Professor Reinhartz exposed the pitfalls last week, would have us believe. Although the scriptural heritage shared by Jews and Christians objectively thrust their literate elites into competition for the legacy of biblical Israel, and despite the dialogue in which those elites unsurprisingly engaged, Christians seem to have been, for the rabbis, to put it with Ron Nagel, a not so significant other. This continued asymmetry in ancient Jewish-Christian relations may have something to do with the different foci in the production of religious knowledge that the two intellectual communities treasured. While Christian theologians identified the object of their faith with rationality, the rabbis located that principle squarely in their own hermeneutical operations. Thus, while Christians, enamored with the exclusive truthfulness of their belief, endeavored to bring a recalcitrant jury under its universally ability saving power, the rabbis, focused as they were on the exclusive legitimacy of their own methods for knowledge production, remained unmoved by those calls and uninterested in interlocution with actors who appeared placed in a mistaken order of discourse. The last thing I'd like to say concerns the question of the metaphor, to whose semiotic processes both Professor Reinhartz and Professor Hogan in her response introduced us last week with a helpful recap this week. The point I wish to make is in a more discourse analytical and psychoanalytic, specifically Lacanian mode, and it is an attempt at interpreting not the content of the various metaphors, mother, daughter, sibling traditions, cousin traditions, the parting of the ways, two twins in Rebecca's womb, etc., but the very fact of their proliferation to describe early Jewish Christian entanglements. There seems to be solid psychoanalytic ground for the idea advanced by Professor Reinhartz in the series that the metaphors employed by scholars in their treatment of ancient Jewish Christian relations come to relieve an anxiety. The clever amphibology carried by the separation anxieties of this series title entices us to ask whether the affective states we are talking about are those of actants eagerly anxious to be separated, or of subjects angered by the possibility of the separation. While for Freud, separation from the mother is the earliest cause of anxiety for the subject, Jacques Lacan identifies the cause in the lack of separation experienced by the child whom the mother's desire threatens to engulf. Castration, that is, the movement of separation initiated by the law of the father, thus relieves rather than generates anxiety. This paternal operation is tightly connected to the metaphoric process of substitution. The possibility of metaphor as a common linguistic phenomenon, which according to Roman Jacobson represents the axis around which the symbolic production of meaning occurs, is founded by the paternal metaphor, that is, by the substitution of the name of the father for the anguishing desire of the mother. Metaphor, in sum, presides over the possibility of remedying the anxiety deriving from being the object of an obscure desire on the part of the other. This may point us in the direction of an explanation for the seemingly never-ending metaphoric process activated in contemporary times by the study of Christian-Jewish relations. Those metaphors, as Professor Reinhartz reminds us with regard to the image of the parting of the ways, come to us not from the ancient sources, but from contemporary scholarship, wherein anxieties about the demands the two groups place on each other pervade both Jewish and Christian discourse. It's easy to see how Judaism, as long as it remains unconverted to faith in Christ, does not cease to be structurally the object of a request on the part of Christianity, however respectful or even withheld the formulation of that request might be. It is less intuitive to recognize that desire runs also in the opposite direction. Judaism, ever since the Enlightenment and that radical reconfiguration of its place within corporate Europe that was Jewish emancipation, cannot avoid presenting Western Christian societies with a troubling request for satisfaction, in the form of a demand for recognition, accommodation, and integration that some would consider prototypical or paradigmatic of the condition of minority or minoritization in the nation state. 2 millennia after the parting of the never parting ways, the twins remain caught in an imaginary knot that continues to fill their existences with anxiety. Professor Reinhartz, it was an honor to be able to respond to your talk in this series, and I look forward to continuing our conversation on these studies. Thank you very much.
So questions?
I would just want to say, I don't have any questions or any comeback. I just want to say how interesting to look at that very impulse towards metaphorization and what is propelling that. So I thought that was a very interesting, seems to me an important thing to think about that I hadn't thought about till I heard this.
It's not that common, I think, in the examination of Asian history. It's not. It doesn't happen very often that we refer to so many metaphors.
No, that's right. And I think it's because, well, I always assumed that it was because there wasn't one that really fit. It's kind of like these jokes about how many, I don't know, elephants you can fit into a Volkswagen or something like that, that there's always something that gets left out. And so people, that propels the search for a new metaphor. But I think what you suggested is it could go beyond that there's something beyond that propellant.
So I think the question of where is the impulse to use metaphors is really interesting, but I'm not yet ready to go there before asking you my question, which is hyper literal. But so I was curious about the specificity of Rhodes, of the scholars who first came up with these metaphors and then used them. And so you started by saying that the metaphor is a civil engineering metaphor and a transportation metaphor. So I was curious about, first, what are the roads that the people who use the metaphor were using? So roads in California are highways and they look a particular way, and roads in Manhattan are different. And so I'm curious, it's a little bit to ask you a little bit to reflect on the situatedness of the scholars who use and then revise the metaphor, if their sort of geographical context, in addition to their intellectual context, impacted how they thought about the metaphor itself. And then the second question is, I'm curious about if the question of the parting of the ways relates specifically to the Roman imperial context of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, and whether the Roman road system and the importance of the Roman road system within the Roman Empire plays a role in any way in the way that the scholars are thinking about Judaism and Christianity traveling on these so-called Roman roads.
Okay, those are great questions. I'm going to talk about the second one first as I stall and think about an answer to the first one. From the reading that I've done, I haven't come across anyone who relates this metaphor at all to the road systems developed in the Roman Empire. And I think that's because the metaphor itself, parting of the ways, is a metaphor that's used in all kinds of different contexts. And so it's easy to forget that it's a metaphor. Even in the study of Christianity and Judaism, people forget that it's a metaphor. They take it simply as a straightforward description without understanding that it's metaphorical language. And so I haven't come across, it would be interesting to think about that actually, but I don't think that it would map onto that onto that very well. And I think that that's the same of the individual, of the road experiences of the people who proposed it. I was always struck by Folks-Jackson referring to the parting of the roads, not the parting of the ways, which implied to me maybe a more rural existence. I don't know anything about him as a person, so I don't really know. What I will say is that I first started thinking about this question during a period of time, a 3-year period of time, when I was commuting from where I lived in Southern Ontario to another city to work. And that other city was an hour away. And most of that hour was spent on a multi-lane highway, the 401, for those of you familiar with Toronto. And I felt like I spent my whole time changing lanes. That's all I did. It was an accident that I was moving forward, because what I was really doing just was moving sideways. And I started thinking about this. I actually wrote an article at the time called Fork in the Road or Multi-Lane Highway. And it really reflected my own experience about this, paying attention to exit signs and exit ramps. And really, so in my own thinking about it, it's very much informed by that experience of roadway, of daily anxiety. But I don't know that that plays into how the metaphor actually developed.
And just one follow-up, you said that the metaphor started in the 1930s. So I'm wondering the move from pedestrian to automobile drivers and sort of the modes of transportation, like we're not talking about train tracks, right? So I'm wondering about even the modes of transportation and sort of the radical shift in how we use our roads.
Yeah, again, I don't know if that's the case. So it first occurs, as far as I know, in 1912, and then occurs again once in 1934, but it doesn't become popular until the 90s, by which point that shift has, of course, really taken hold. But that's also the point at which it's not even seen as a metaphor anymore. And I think that's why we also end up with this kind of confusion between roadway and divorce, because it's really seen far more in relational terms than it is in roadway terms. Yeah.
I'm not an academic, but I've done I'm not an academic in any way, but I've done most of my reading in this area with Shai Cohen and Boyd Aaron. So I guess I sort of fell into the road. But I always saw it as more like a fork. And I don't know how that fits into it, when I see a road and something going off, I see one progressing forward and then you have something going in a different direction. But I sort of see it more like this, the development of Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, Christianity, and then whatever this was, Israelite religion back here. I don't know how that fits into it.
Okay, I think that's a good point. And there are two ways of seeing it. And I think traditionally, when people have talked about the parting of the ways, they have visualized it like a Y, right? You've got a road, one single road, and then it diverges in two different directions. And that's a different way, but seeing what Alan Siegel said, two siblings, right? Two siblings come from a single parent, and then they separate. But I prefer not to see it that way. And that's why I like the metaphor of the multi-lane highway, because we know that we didn't only have rabbinic Judaism. We didn't only have the kind of Christianity that is represented by church fathers who, we had all kinds of other things as well. And then we might argue whether it's Christianity that's just branched off and Judaism kind of continued on its way and developed in all kinds of other ways, separate from that branch that branched off. So I think there are different ways of conceptualizing it, but I would suggest that the fork in the road probably oversimplifies, or doesn't, at least it doesn't acknowledge the diversity both within Judaism and Christianity as they develop.
Maybe a bush, not a tree.
Now we can generate our own metaphors. And every time I've spoken about this, it ends up with people saying, what about this? Or what about that? You know, and that speaks to the impulse to generate metaphors to describe this process.
What about Quo Vadis?
What about Quo Vadis? Talking about the movie or?
It's a road. It's a road.
Okay, it's a road. Okay, but what about it? How do you see that as relevant to the,
Maybe this is the road, talking of the way,
maybe? I don't know.
because it was before 1912.
It was before
It was
1912.
the end of the 19th century.
What are you talking about, the movie?
No,
Or the book?
There was a book.
There was a book before, late 19th century, and then it got made into several movies. There's a silent movie, and then there's a talk, I think, in the teens and then in the 30s. Yeah.
I have a question. One of the things that I've heard today is sort of a changing conception of in the scholarship of what constitutes an ism, right? So a few of the things you raised, for example, attending church and synagogues, right? It does being part of an ism mean rituals or events, or is it beliefs? Is it the leadership, the social contact? And also regarding the sort of the absence of evidence that we don't have. I wonder if sort of in the last century or less, as we've started to think differently about the evidence we don't have, and started to read early Christian texts as polemic or rhetorical, as opposed to just sort of a narrative description. And you know, both sort of rabbinic texts and early Christian texts being written by leadership, right, and not necessarily reflecting what many other folks were thinking. As Dr. Fiano said, in those, there is an anxiety, a desire to separate, not necessarily the rabbinic text, but the early Christian texts, as you said, John Chrysostom, like you know, stay away from there, don't go there. There's an anxiety, a need to be separate. I wonder if it's inevitable that we think about the parting as a conflict or in some way polemical because the written evidence that we have from the early Christians is polemical, right? I wonder if we're reflecting sort of the anxieties that are in those texts, and if there's a way around that based on sort of our lack of evidence.
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. I think that the anxieties are there in the ancient texts as well, and maybe even more pronounced than in the scholarship. If you read, well, the Gospel of John, it's clearly a very text that's really anxious about Jews. And then the question, of course, is why is that the case? And conflict is a feature of those texts. Whether for polemical reasons or, as I would also suggest, for narrative reasons, you have to tell a story. And, you know, conflict is central to the story. You have to justify also certain positions. So I think, you know, I'm not sure how that helps us in the context if we try to think about the Jewish side to the story. And, you know, what you've noticed in the ancient texts is exactly the reason that I think we have to be careful about using those texts, New Testament texts, patristic texts, as accurate descriptions of Jewish responses to Christian claims. Is precisely because there is an anxiety around Jews in those texts, and those Jews are engaged, and those texts are engaged in a certain process. As far as the isms are concerned, well, there's lots of critique of using isms at all, as I mentioned in my first talk, you know, around terminology. But what's good about the isms is their vagueness. And so, you know, if you think about Judaism or Christianity, we don't have to really, we can include under those labels beliefs, practices, varieties of beliefs and practices, different sets of institutions. There are certain types of, sometimes we want to be very specific about it, but sometimes we just need a general term because we're talking about something else. So you just need a general term to let you then get on with the thing you really want to talk about. And the isms, I think, can be helpful for that purpose.
So
I had a question about material culture. And in light of lack of text, I mean, the whole scholarship is based on text.
Yeah.
All right. And as we heard from you and from the comments and from scholarship, as we know, they are problematic in that way. You also mentioned, and that was very striking, that sort of that silence on Jewish part, and we should pause and think what it means. And I think that's very helpful. But I'm wondering whether we could, scholars certainly for the period that I study, early modern period, where they are lacking, or even colonial studies, where they are lacking evidence, they're looking for other written evidence, they're looking for other ways to understand the other voices. So it made me think about the material culture and archaeology and geography and things like that. And you mentioned a little bit about the stalls at this way.
The Sardis around, yeah.
And the example that comes to mind that is so wonderful and striking is obviously the synagogue and the church across from each other in Capernaum,
Yeah.
right? Capernaum. And the material of the synagogue is not from that place. So it's a very self-conscious way of bringing different material to separate one structure from the church, which is built with native rock. So I wonder whether we can sort of think about and extend this thinking about these parting processes by looking also at the material remains.
Yeah. I think in principle we can, and people have been trying to do that, and written books about that. I think that it's easier to do for the 4th century and onwards than it is for the earlier period, simply because of what is available. And so I'm thinking, for example, of something that Stephen Fine drew to my attention in Laodicea, where there is what seems to have been a church that perhaps used to be a Jewish place of worship. We don't know exactly, but there's I think it's a menorah on top of which was incised a cross very, very deeply. And he interprets this really as a supersession, an act of supersessionism, and taking over space and taking over symbols and superimposing Christian symbols on Jewish symbols. Okay, fine, but that's 5th, 6th century, something like that. So I think we can do it much more easily for the later period where we have more remains. In Ephesus also, there's a lot of very intriguing material in Ephesus. There's inscriptions there about Jews and God-fearers and so on. The problem is, and I'm not an archaeologist, so I can't, I'm intrigued by all of this, but I don't claim at all any expertise, which is why I stick with text. But it seems to me that one of the questions is, how do we interpret those symbols? That without texts, we sometimes don't have a broader context in which to understand exactly what this material culture can give us or tell us. And I think that's another reason that it's easier to deal with the material from 4th century onwards, because we have a richer supply, a broader supply of other kinds of evidence that we can use to amplify an unusual sort of process.
There are these 2 volumes of, I think by Franciscan fathers of funerary epigraphy for the most part, that allegedly testify to Jewish Christian hybridity, where the symbolism is interpreted as being Jewish Christian, and it's very debated.
Yeah,
Emanuel attests that.
I mean, it's all very interesting. Then it's hard to know, what do we have? What proportion of the total do we have? And do these things that we find, even if we find them in great number, what do they represent? It's all very interesting. Yeah.
So if I may, first of all, thank you very much for this. I thought of and read most of us starting at the West, wasn't aware of the transportation aspects of this. I would actually only refer to the divorce aspects of it. And so a lot of my conceptualization of this metaphor, I always imagined sort of this idea of that when a couple gets divorced, there are children and sort of, and so parsing out, I think out of maybe this desire to have metaphor, I've always thought about more in some ways like parting of homes, because in divorces, you live in separate homes, the parties live in separate homes.
Right.
And part of my interest is material culture as well. And so I just think of like Euroropos, for instance, where you have two communities that are 150 meters apart, but clearly residing in two different homes. That sort of gets at some of this evidence. So I'd like to hear maybe if your conceptualization of sort of how the social interaction may be results of this children, but the fact that they are residing in homes, different homes ultimately, pretty early on.
Yeah, I think that supports my general point that the absence or presence of social contact is not actually criterion.
Sure.
And it's because for me, when I think about the parting of the ways, it's institutional and community based. It's not about what one person does or another person does. And that was really the point I tried to make. People can do whatever they do, and people will do all kinds of hybrid things. We know that in our own lives as well. I'm sure we all have examples of the different ways in which we construct our identities that, might involve some boundary crossing, that others might perceive as boundary crossing in one way or another. So if we look at it institutionally, then that would correspond metaphorically to the homes, right? And then people do what they need to do. And, the fact is that many couples who divorce continue to have social contact with each other because they have to negotiate around children. Business partners can have a parting of the ways as well. And they may or may not have social contact. And so it's not a viable criterion in that sense. I think the comparison to different homes is a good one, and that we need to look at institutional conceptualizations, not necessarily buildings and not necessarily how things really are, but how boundaries are conceptualized, whether they're enacted in that way.
So the final question is from viewer online. Do you see any parallels between the church's evolving stance toward Judaism and the suppression and eventual elimination of Gnosticism?
Oh, I am not going to touch Gnosticism. I'm sorry. First of all, there's a debate about whether we can really talk about Gnosticism. All of these labels are contested, and Gnosticism is one of those. And honestly, I claim no expertise whatsoever. There is a way in which, people have talked about, and Daniel Boyarin is one of these people, that the patristic rhetoric about heresy, which ended up labeling certain groups as heretical, and often we associate those with the label Gnostic as well, that was a process of self-definition. And so in that sense, it's implicated in the parting of the ways. But that I think is a different matter than the idea of the suppression of Gnosticism. And we have lots of Gnostic texts, and I think we need to think about whether whether they were really suppressed or not, those groups.
So I'm going to just jump in really quickly. And first of all, thank you for 3 really thought-provoking, interesting lectures. To thank Emanuel for a wonderful, equally thought-provoking response. To thank Karina and Michael for their responses in previous sessions. To thank Mara and Natalie and Dakota for your introductions. To thank all of you for coming, and to welcome you back to all of our future programming all semester. And we hope that we'll have many conversations this semester with you on campus.
Thank you. Thank you very much.